Over the summer, I went on a date here in the District of Columbia, where I've lived for over a decade. And during the conversation, the date said to me, "Think of it like you have 537 representatives in Congress already," implying that we didn't need our own senators or representatives in the House, and somehow that these representatives who were voted by people in other states and in other very different parts of the country would represent our best interest as residents of the District of Columbia. There are currently over 700,000 people living in the District of Columbia, and it is a city full of diverse neighborhoods, lots of history, culture, great food, just an amazing place to be. There's so much happening here. We happened to be having dinner at a restaurant that sits on the Anacostia River, and the sun is setting, the boats are going by on the water. It was just really incredible, and I was shocked in that moment that this person would say that to me. And also went on to argue that a very old sentiment about exclusive legislation, which I'll talk about in a moment, that if the District of Columbia were its own state surrounding the federal buildings, that would somehow, that could go wrong if the states denied protection or something like that. However, we sort of saw the opposite of that happen on January 6th last year, where the District of Columbia was unable to call their own National Guard forward to protect the Capitol building and the area around the Capitol because the executive branch, the White House, actually declined those requests and withheld that protection from the city, from the neighborhood I live in. It was remarkable to watch. So I want to talk a little bit about where did this come from, this idea that the federal district needed to be independent and have and be ruled by the federal government rather than its own state. And I uncovered some actually very interesting stories and historical data about where that originated, how it came to be, and what has sustained it up until our current time. It's interesting that one of the major mantras during our Revolutionary War, our war for independence from the British, was no taxation without representation. However, in the late 1700s, not long after that war, there was introduced an idea in a bill for exclusive legislation over the federal district. And there has not been a reconciliation between those two concepts since. Now, where did the exclusive legislation come from? Well, it turns out in the 1780s, shortly after the Revolutionary War, there was a protest from Revolutionary War vets demanding back pay, and they were protesting outside of the Pennsylvania Executive Council. And the two government bodies that were there were the Continental Army and the Confederate Congress. And the protesters were protesting the Continental Army and ignoring the Confederate Congress because they didn't think the Confederate Congress would have the funds to pay up. This angered Alexander Hamilton, that they were being ignored. He felt like that they should be protested just as equally as the Continental Army. So he immediately called for the protesters to be dispersed and made a big fuss about it, while the Pennsylvania Executive Council negotiated with the protesters and came to a settlement. And that further angered Hamilton. And then from that situation, he called it the Philadelphia Mutiny and created a conversation that Congress could be held hostage to state interests unless it had full control of the Capitol. The Organic Act of 1801 was passed shortly after, which then completely stripped away the voting rights of DC residents, who were able to vote before then. And Congress claimed exclusive legislation over the federal district, which was originally meant to be 10 square miles. It's currently 64 square miles. And this all stemmed from a bruised ego from a Confederate soldier named Alexander Hamilton. Also during this time, James Madison expressed concern. A war vet named Sam Osgood predicted accurately that, quote, "this space is capable of holding 2 million people." There are currently 700,000 residents, but pre-COVID, the city would grow to up to 2 million people a day who would come into the city from the suburbs to work. So he was actually very accurate in that. So there were other people around this time that were very concerned that people who lived in this district would lose their right to vote. However, we roll into the Civil War. Reconstruction brought together black and white voters during that time. The black men were able to vote by 1867, and thousands of former slaves migrated to the DC area. And there became this very ambitious and successful experiment in biracial democracy. There were black public schools, black churches and institutions, black home and land ownership. Howard University was founded during this time. There were black aldermen, city council members, school boards, government positions, and this growing black middle class. Now, the success of this garnered a huge backlash from who? You guessed it, white conservatives, who lobbied for segregation and lobbied for a territorial government with presidential appointees, which founded then the Board of Public Works. And that was passed before 1874. So shortly after the Civil War, this biracial government was eliminated, and the Board of Public Works was instilled with 3 appointees to manage the District of Columbia, which by that time was already its own entity, its own city. There is a quote, the idea of burning down the barn to kill the rats. At that time, there was an article in The Nation, a paper of the time, that said, "Not a vestige is left of popular municipal government. Aldermen, common councilmen, mayors, board works, school boards, police boards, all are swept away, and the entire government is handed over to 3 men appointed by a foreign authority, responsible not for their fellow citizens, but to the president and the Senate." And this was recognized as a disaster, but the disdain for black people and the fear of black people gaining power was so strong that the paper said things like, the Evening Star said, restoring suffrage would lead once again to black power and Negro domination. The Washington Post had an article which said the present form of government is about as bad as can be devised, yet a system which gives control of the district to ignorant and depraved Negroes is still worse. These sentiments continued into the early part of the 20th century. Segregation and Jim Crow era, these things became law, the things changed, and it kind of, we fell into this segregated society. The statehood and the right of DC residents to vote even was ignored during the women's suffrage movement of the 19 teens and 20s. And over the next 50 years or so, referendums showed a majority support among DC residents for both home rule, that they could create their own laws and manage their own budget, and representation in Congress, which has continued to be denied. One party favors, the other party favors. Nobody sets a bill. The House passes a bill, the Senate declines. The Senate passes a bill, the House declines. It just has not come together to actually be passed, although it's been very close. So during World War II, the same kind of rhetoric continues. The city would be ruled by the underprivileged, illiterate proletarian class. The alley would dominate the avenue, right? These racial diatribes continue throughout the 20th century. No surprise when you look at what was happening nationally. Of course, the white conservatives in power would not allow a black power, like a majority black city, to rise to power during that time. Other things happening during the 1969, half of the city is decimated, well, not quite, but 2 of the major districts decimated by the riots after the assassination of the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. And the 1980s brought through a major drug epidemic to the District of Columbia. And in the late 1990s, Bill Clinton added to the presidential limo license plate taxation without representation, which is what my license plate says to this day, because we are taxed without representation. We have one of the highest gross domestic products per capita in the country, and yet still, not that should matter, even if we had the lowest, we should still have the right to vote. We should still have representation in Congress. Currently, in conclusion, this year, H.R. 51 has passed the House as part of the Biden and Democrat domestic agenda. However, currently, as you know, they're focused on infrastructure and other bills which have taken the front burner. And once again, DC Statehood is pushed to the back. It's unlikely that's going to happen, frankly. And if it doesn't in the next couple of years, it may not happen for another 50. But I wanted to wrap up this speech by saying that the antiquated ideas of white slave-owning men of the 17 and 1800s may not be the best match for our current reality. Certainly some ideas that were created during that time they are great things, right? They've always been a little flawed though, and it's up to us, like the abolition of slavery and other laws that have evolved over time, that we ought to adapt and correct these injustices whenever possible. We need to be honest about the origin of exclusive legislation and the continued effort and motivations to deny suffrage in the District of Columbia. The denial of DC statehood and representation in Congress has everything to do with suppressing Black votes, Black voters, and Black influence, and also, in addition to that, Democratic votes and Democratic voters and additional Democratic representation in Congress. The time for DC statehood is now. Thank you.